Every crown has a price. That's not a metaphor. That's not poetry. That is, quite literally, the most accurate way to describe what happened to Michael Jackson. Because the world gave him a title that no performer before him had ever fully earned. King of Pop. And what almost nobody talks about, what gets buried under the records and the record-breaking sales and the iconic moonwalk, is the bill that came attached to that crown. A bill that started accumulating when he was a child too young to understand what he was signing up for. A bill that compounded with every album, every tour, every headline. And a bill that was finally, completely, irreversibly paid, on a Thursday afternoon in June of 2009. Because being the king of pop did not just cost Michael Jackson his privacy. It cost him his childhood, his health, his peace of mind, and eventually, it cost him everything. The price started small, almost invisible, a few missed birthday parties. A few skipped days of ordinary childhood while the Jackson 5 rehearsed for hours that would have exhausted grown professionals. Michael was 5 years old when he started performing publicly. 5. An age when most children are learning to tie their shoes. Michael Jackson was learning to hold an audience's attention for an entire set. And the price of that early excellence, the price of being recognized, at 5 years old, as something extraordinary, was that the ordinary parts of childhood quietly disappeared. Not all at once. Gradually. The way water erodes stone. You don't see it happening day to day. You only see it when you compare the beginning to the end and realize how much has been worn away. By the time Michael was a teenager, the price had escalated dramatically. Because global fame for a child is not the same experience as global fame for an adult. An adult chooses fame, in most cases, with at least some understanding of what they're trading away. A child does not choose it. A child simply lives inside whatever reality the adults around them have constructed. And the reality constructed around Michael Jackson was one where ordinary social development, the awkward, unglamorous, essential process of figuring out who you are through trial and error among peers who don't already know your name, was simply not available to him. He couldn't walk through a mall, couldn't sit in a regular classroom, couldn't experience the small humiliations and small triumphs that most people use to build their sense of self. Instead, he built his identity entirely inside the world of performance. Which meant that performance, and the audience's response to it, became the primary, and eventually the only, mechanism through which Michael Jackson understood his own worth. That single fact, more than any tabloid headline, more than any controversy, is the foundation of everything that happened afterward. Because when your sense of self-worth is constructed entirely around public approval, you become permanently, structurally vulnerable to public disapproval. Every bad review isn't just professional feedback. It's an attack on your fundamental sense of whether you deserve to exist. Every joke at your expense isn't just a joke. It's evidence, gathered and filed away, that the love might not be real. And Michael Jackson, brilliant, sensitive, extraordinarily talented Michael Jackson, spent his entire adult life essentially defenseless against a world that had taught him, from the age of 5, that his value was measured exclusively in applause. But that's not even the craziest part of the price he paid. Because as Thriller exploded across the planet in 1982 and turned Michael into something closer to a religious icon than a pop star, the financial price of maintaining that level of stardom began to reveal itself. Security, privacy measures, legal protection, an entire industry of people whose job was to manage, protect, and monetize Michael Jackson's image. And every single one of those people needed Michael to keep performing. Needed Michael to keep producing. Needed the machine to keep running, because the machine was now what fed dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of careers and livelihoods that orbited around him. Michael Jackson was not just an artist anymore. He had become an economy. And economies do not get to rest when the person at their center is exhausted. Economies do not get to take a year off to process grief or trauma or the basic human need for unstructured time. The machine needs to keep moving. And Michael, more than almost anyone in entertainment history, understood exactly how many people's mortgages depended on him keeping it moving. The physical price came next. And this is where the story turns genuinely dark. Because in January 1984, while filming a Pepsi commercial, Pyrotechnics misfired and set Michael's scalp on fire in front of a live audience. Second and third degree burns. Surgery, a recovery that introduced him, for the first time, to serious prescription pain medication. And here's what almost nobody understood at the time, and what the public still struggles to fully grasp even now. The medication didn't just treat physical pain. For a nervous system that had been operating in a state of heightened anxiety since childhood, that had never known what genuine internal quiet felt like, the medication offered something it had never experienced. Relief. Not just from the burn, from the noise, from the pressure, from the relentless internal monitoring of how he was being perceived. And once a person discovers that a substance can quiet that particular kind of suffering, the relationship with that substance becomes almost impossible to fully sever. That single accident, that one misfired pyrotechnic charge, set in motion a dependency that would shadow Michael Jackson for the rest of his life. What happened next shocked the people closest to him, even though, looking back, the warning signs had been accumulating for years. The physical transformations accelerated, the skin changes, the surgical alterations, the increasingly fragile, almost ghost-like public appearance that replaced the vibrant, athletic performer of the early 1980s. The tabloids turned this into spectacle, into mockery, into a running joke that dominated headlines for over a decade. But what the jokes never accounted for, what the mockery conveniently ignored, was the actual human cause underneath the transformation. A man in genuine, documented physical pain. A man with vitiligo, a real skin condition. A man whose relationship with his own body had been damaged since childhood by a father who criticized his appearance in front of other people. The price of fame, in Michael's case, included having his most private struggles turned into the world's favorite punchline. And then came 1993. The price jumped to a category that no level of fame should ever require anyone to pay. The accusation from the Chandler family. The investigation. The strip search. The months of public speculation about whether Michael Jackson was a monster. And whatever the truth of that situation, a truth that remains contested and painful and is not the subject of this video, what is undeniable is the psychological toll it took on a man who had spent his entire life desperately needing the world's love and approval. To have that love replaced, even temporarily, even by a portion of the public, with suspicion and revulsion, was a price that very nearly broke him completely. People close to him described someone who stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping, increased his reliance on medication to a level that alarmed even the people who had grown accustomed to his dependency. The settlement in 1994 closed the legal chapter. It did nothing to close the psychological one. The price kept compounding through the 2000s. The 2003 documentary. The arrest. The 2005 trial that turned Michael Jackson's private life into the most consumed media event of the decade. The acquittal that should have brought relief but instead left him hollowed out, having spent everything he had just to survive the process of proving his innocence. By the time the verdict was read, Michael Jackson did not look like a man who had won. He looked like a man who had been fundamentally, permanently altered by what he had survived. And in the years that followed, living abroad, attempting to rebuild some version of ordinary life for himself and his children, the price was still being paid. Quietly, privately, in ways the cameras weren't there to capture. But here is the final, devastating installment of the price. The one that came due in 2009. Because by the time the This Is It tour was announced, Michael Jackson's body had been paying the cumulative cost of 45 years of extraordinary pressure. The medication dependency, which had begun with a single pyrotechnic accident in 1984, had evolved into something that required nightly administration of a surgical anesthetic just to produce sleep. Propofol, a drug never intended for home use, never intended for anything resembling the circumstances under which it was being given to him. And on June 25, 2009, in a rented mansion in Los Angeles, the price that had been accumulating since Michael Jackson was 5 years old finally came due in full. His heart, weakened by decades of strain that the public never fully saw, simply stopped. He was 50 years old. The price of being the king of pop was not paid in a single transaction. It was paid in installments, across 5 decades, in currencies that most people never have to spend. Childhood, physical safety, psychological stability, the ordinary human right to make a mistake in private, the basic dignity of being allowed to be unwell without it becoming international news. Michael Jackson paid every one of those installments. Faithfully, relentlessly, because the alternative, stepping away from the fame that had defined him since he could barely walk, was a kind of death he feared more than the literal one that eventually found him. What makes this story genuinely tragic, and not simply sad, is the recognition that the very thing that destroyed Michael Jackson was inseparable from the thing that made him extraordinary. The same hypersensitivity that made his music so emotionally devastating was the hypersensitivity that made public criticism unbearable. The same perfectionism that produced Thriller was the perfectionism that pushed his body past what it could sustain. The same need for love that made him pour himself so completely into every performance was the need that made the 1993 and 2005 accusations feel like existential threats rather than legal proceedings to be weathered. You cannot separate the gift from the wound. They were built from the same material. And that is the tragic price of being the king of pop. Not that fame corrupted a normal person, but that an extraordinary person was placed inside a machine that had no mechanism for protecting the very qualities that made him extraordinary in the first place. The crown is still there. The music still plays in stadiums and weddings and car radios across every country on earth. The records still stand, mostly unbroken, more than 4 decades after they were set. But the price, the actual, human, irreversible price that was paid to create that legacy, is something the world has never fully reckoned with. Because it's easier to enjoy the music than to sit with what it cost. Easier to celebrate the king than to ask what kingdom is actually worth a child's entire developmental experience, an adult's entire nervous system, and ultimately, a 50-year-old man's last breath. That question doesn't have a comfortable answer, and maybe that's exactly why it still hasn't been asked loudly enough.